going to start in about 1 minute. I'm making that announcement largely for the people who are in the back who are recording today's program. There are a number of people who are interested in our discussion today, but they aren't able to be here, or they're working remotely. So we made a commitment to make sure that they had the opportunity to hear the discussion. As you are coming into the room, I think you may have noted that we have sign-up sheets. So if you want to register for CLE credit, please leave us your name and appropriate ID on the forms in the hallway so that we can take care of that with you. I think I've gotten the green sign that we're going to go ahead with the program. So I want to first make the announcement to say, if you're sitting comfortably in the back and you want to stay there, it's all good. But if you'd like to come forward, we welcome you. Good afternoon and welcome to Town Hall. My name is Sharon Sells-Belton, and I'm the Vice President for Strategic Partnerships and Community Relations. We're delighted that you've joined us for our conversation today with Roberta Walburn, author of the book, Miles Lord, the Maverick Judge Who Brought Corporate America to Justice. Our conversation with Ms. Walburn will be moderated by Jack Tunheim, who is our Chief Judge of the U.S. State Court for the Minnesota District. I will more formally introduce our honored guest in just a moment. Today's program is a partnership between Thomson Reuters and the Law and Democracy Initiative, a project for Books for Africa. We're hosting this program today in recognition of their 30th anniversary serving our community. Pat Plonsky, who is the Executive Director of Books for Africa, is here with us today. Pat, would you please stand? And as well, I know that there are some other members who are past or current members of the Board of Directors who are also with us. Welcome to Thomson Reuters. Let's give them a round of applause. I wanted you to know that Thomson Reuters has partnered with Books for Africa and the Law and Democracy Initiative since 2008. Since that time, we have donated over 90 Thomson Reuters libraries to law schools, to governments, and to human rights organizations across the continent of Africa. The legal publications are donated from our warehouse here in I was going to say Minneapolis, but we know it's really Egan. Carswell in Canada, Sweeten Maxwell in the United Kingdom, and Revista in Brazil. This is truly a family affair. The partnership also includes an annual book drive, and money's donated to ship containers to Africa, and I'm so delighted to recognize all of my colleagues here who are a part of that exceptional program, and I want to publicly, on behalf of the company, thank you for your generosity. I'd also like to just briefly, if I could, thank Erica Karras and Nicole Hansen, Keila Duran, and Amanda Myers and Alex Brochette for their assistance in helping us to put on today's program. Let's give them a little round of applause, please. You know, you can't do these things without volunteers and without support. And as I mentioned previously, we have applied for CLE credits for today's program. We also want you to know that after our conversation today, we'll have a brief reception out in the foyer, and Roberta will be available to sign books. And so we're delighted to offer that. So let me go on with our program. I'm not sure all of you remember Judge Miles Lord, but I do, and I remember his humble beginnings on the Minnesota Iron Range, and I also know that he is included, at least in my book and on my list, as one of Minnesota's or Midwestern progressives that include people like Hubert Humphrey, Eugene McCarthy, Walter Mondale, and one of my own personal favorites, Don Frazier. I personally added him to that list. Miles Lord reshaped jurisprudence with his precedent-setting book, his precedent-breaking rulings on issues ranging from women's rights to consumer protection and to educational reform. I won't tell you all of the rich stories associated with these groundbreaking rulings. We'll hear a little bit more about that from our honored guest. Today's conversation, however, will give us a glimpse into the life of a man and his role in shaping Minnesota's history and as well U.S. history. Let me just move to introducing our honored guest. A little bit about our author. Roberta Walburn is of counsel at the Cerisi Collin law firm, and she played a pivotal role in Minnesota's groundbreaking lawsuit against the tobacco industry. Many of us remember that litigation. Previously, she was a reporter with the Minneapolis Star Tribune and a legislative assistant to Senator Paul Wellstone, and a law clerk, of course, to U.S. District Judge Miles W. Lord. About our moderator. Most of us know the moderator quite well, but I still want to provide an introduction. Jack Tunheim is the Chief Judge of the U.S. District Court for the District of Minnesota. Judge Tunheim graduated from the University of Minnesota Law School. He was a law clerk to U.S. District Court Judge Earl Larson, another Minnesota favorite. He served as the Chief Deputy State Attorney General. He also serves as the chairman of the Assassination Records Review Board, which oversaw the collection of records relating to the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. Ladies and gentlemen, please help us to welcome our honored guest. The next voice that you'll hear will be that of Jack Tunheim.
Thank you, Sharon, very much, and I just want to point out and thank you, Sharon, for your role in helping us choose magistrate judges for our court. You've been a stellar member of our merit selection committees and helped us attract really top-notch legal talent for our magistrate judge position. So, well, I'm happy to be here today with my friend Roberta Walburn, who has written a remarkably interesting book. I got to look at an advanced copy so I could write a review of it, and I couldn't put it down. It's really well done. Let me just ask you, every now and then, somewhere where I go, someone says to me, I know one of your judges, Miles Lord. How's he doing? And say hi to him for me. And I said, well, he left our court 33 years ago, and he passed away 2 years ago. But other than that, things are fine. What made Miles Lord so well known to so many people in both the legal world and with the public in Minnesota?
A couple things. I mean, for people who were too young to remember when Miles was on the bench, he served on the bench from 1966 to 1985. He loved to take on the most challenging cases, not only in the state but in the country. And I used to wonder how he'd get all these giant cases. And as you know, Judge, I mean, the cases are assigned randomly through the clerk of court's office. So it wasn't that he was getting any different kind of rotation of cases from other judges, but he would make the most out of every case and try and he was very active in taking on these cases. And he loved the press. He loved seeing his name in the headlines. He loved getting press for himself and the cases he was working on. And there were a couple of reasons for that. One is his ego. He had no small ego. But he also felt, as Sharon mentioned, one of his good friends was Hubert Humphrey, and Hubert had taught him that the more the public knows about how the court system works, the better the court system will work. And oftentimes what happens in the courtroom stays within the small community of judges and attorneys. And Miles thought that people should know about it. So, and he was very colorful too. So he was taking on these giant cases, reserve mining, Dalcon Shield, IUD litigation, making big and bold rulings that often broke with precedent. And he was very colorful and outspoken. So the combination of all those factors, he was in the headlines coast to coast for many years.
All of us as judges in the federal system have law clerks. I've had close to 50 now over my career, recent law grads who worked with me for a year or two, and that was no different back in the day when Roberta and I clerked for judges, colleagues on the United States District Court here. I think the story of how you became Judge Lord's law clerk is so interesting. You detail it somewhat in the book. Can you tell us that story?
Yes. So as with just about anything Miles did, and I call him Miles not out of disrespect, but pretty much everybody called him Miles.
Everybody called him Miles.
And he didn't need last name, it was just Miles. As with everything he did, he had a unique way of hiring law clerks. So my experience was I had moved to Minnesota for a job as a reporter on the then Minneapolis Tribune, so that's how many years ago it was before the papers merged. And after a few years of reporting, I decided to go back to school to get a law degree, not because I wanted to be a lawyer, that was the furthest thing from my mind really, but I thought a law degree would help me in journalism and just give me an added credential. And in my second year of law school, one of my colleagues in the newsroom decided to introduce me to Judge Lord, and the three of us went out to lunch, and I met him, but I didn't get a word in edgewise between the two of them that whole lunch. And then a few months later, when I was working nights and weekends at the newspaper and going to school during the day, and I was assigned one night to write a story about a decision that Judge Lord had issued. Now, this is back in 1982, and he issued a decision overruling the city council of Minneapolis, which had refused to grant a permit for one of the early gay block parties. The city council, with typical politics at the time, had denied the permit. It was supported by the mayor at the time, Mayor Frazier. And the case came to the judge, and Miles overruled the city council and ordered them to issue a permit. And so I wrote a little story about it and appeared in the paper. And the day after it appeared in the paper, my phone started to ring at 5 o'clock in the morning, and I was out dead asleep because I'd worked till midnight, and I was sleeping. And I picked up the phone, and here was Judge Lord screaming at me in his most stern voice. So he had been an actor in high school. He loved drama and kept that love of drama throughout his time on the bench. And so I'm trying to wake up, and he's yelling at me that I'd gotten the story all screwed up, that I'd gotten the law wrong, that I'd gotten the facts wrong. And I'm, just trying to get it together to, respond, halfway intelligently. And finally I said, thank you for calling, Judge. Can you tell me exactly what was wrong with the story so we can correct it? At which point he broke out laughing and said, no, the story was fine. I just want to know if you want to come be my law clerk when you graduate. And, I didn't want to be a lawyer and had, no thought of being a law clerk. But when I paused to think about it, he started yelling at me again. So I said yes, and it turned out to be one of the best decisions of my life. After I graduated, I spent a year and a half clerking for him. I figured I could always go back to journalism, but I ended up the clerkship just opened my eyes to the power of the law, and I decided to give that a try too.
Set the stage for us a little bit, Roberta. If you could talk about Judge Lord growing up as a small boy up on the Cuyuna Iron Range up in northern Minnesota during the 20s and the 30s, certainly a pivotal time in our state's history. But tell us a little bit about Miles as a boy.
Yeah, I always wondered every day watching him in action when I clerked for him how he got to be such a maverick, and the answer really lies in the Cuyuna Range. He's really a product of his roots. So he was born in 1919, grew up in Crosby, Ironton, the eighth of 9 children in a very poor family. They had food to eat because they had a garden and chickens out back, but not enough money for all the kids to have coats and shoes and mittens to go to school every day, so they'd alternate going to school. And the Iron Range, of course, in its earlier years was known for epic clashes between the haves and the have-nots. The haves being the big corporate iron mining companies, many of them from out of state, and the have-nots being the workers, many of them immigrants coming in to work those hard, dangerous jobs. And Miles took that in as a young boy. And when he was just about entering grade school, he heard the sermon in church one day about Cain and Abel, and he, in his young mind, envisioned Cain pushing his brother into an iron ore pit from which he couldn't escape. And he vowed at that time that he would be his brother's and his sister's keeper, and he would say that throughout his years on the bench. He really viewed that as his mission. And the other event, well, two other things growing up that really affected him. When he was just about 6 years old, the largest mining disaster in Minnesota history, the Milford mine disaster, took place just outside his town, and 41 miners were killed in a matter of minutes when the mine flooded. And Miles would grow up with many of the boys and girls who lost their fathers in that disaster. And what he remembered from that is the poor town coming together to support the families that had lost their breadwinners. And the other thing that really shaped him from those early years was fighting. He loved to fight with his fists. He was a scrawny little kid, but he would see kids during the lunch hour ganging up on and bullying some small kid, and Miles would leap into the fray, even though he was no bigger than the kid who was getting bullied. And he turned out to be a great fighter. He went on to be a Golden Glove champion, and he took that fighter spirit and fighting bullies throughout his career.
You know, with Miles' prominence as a federal district court judge, and he was chief judge of our court for a time, people sometimes forget or don't remember, or perhaps never even knew that he was the state attorney general for 6 years, I believe, from 1954 through 1960. Tell us about what he focused on when he was attorney general, and then maybe you can tell us a little bit about the end of his tenure there when he wasn't getting along very well with Governor Orville Freeman.
Yeah. Miles ran and won 3 terms as Attorney General. They were 2-year terms at that time, from 54 to 60. During that time, Orville Freeman was the governor. And Miles was, very, very active. Again, he loved being in the press back then, too. Some of the things he was most active in was he still kept a hand in criminal prosecutions. Minneapolis, for years, Minneapolis and St. Paul were known as a haven for gangsters, called the poison spot of the country by the U.S. Attorney General. And there was still, it had been cleaned up quite a bit by Hubert Humphrey, but there was still enough action for an ambitious prosecutor to make his name. And one of his biggest headline-grabbing events, which really led to his resignation as Attorney General, was a huge controversy over, of all things, daylight savings time. So this was 1959, I think, and
fast time, I think they called it.
They called it fast time, and it was the most controversial issue in the state. And the urban areas wanted to move to fast time, and the rural areas wanted to stay on standard time. And the legislature, in its wisdom, passed a series of laws that contradicted each other. And it turned out to be a huge brouhaha with the urban areas, Minneapolis and St. Paul, deciding that they were going to switch to daylight savings time at 2 a.m. on April, 26th, whatever. And that very Saturday, a group of Greater Minnesota farmers and theater owners filed a petition with the Minnesota Supreme Court to stop the time switch. Well, the clocks had already been set ahead, and Miles was Attorney General, and he took to the airwaves to essentially tell the population to ignore. The Supreme Court issued an injunction, and Miles essentially told everyone to ignore what the Supreme Court had done, which did not go over very well with the Supreme Court, and there was some feeling that he might be disbarred, but he ended up with a severe censure, which would kind of follow him throughout his career.
Interesting. Now, there's a story that you tell in the book about Miles and working for his then boss, Robert Kennedy, the Attorney General of the United States, and being involved at some point with Jimmy Hoffa prosecutions. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So when I was clerking for the judge, he used to tell these stories all the time, and one of the stories was about, how Jimmy Hoffa had spit on him in a courtroom in Chicago, and I chalked it up at the time to just a tall tale, and lo and behold, when I started to research the book, it turned out to be true. So it turned out Bobby Kennedy, of course, had Jimmy Hoffa in his sights for many years, and it turned out that Hoffa's main bagman was from Minnesota, a Minnesota businessman. And when Miles was appointed U.S. Attorney by John Kennedy in the early 60s, he started to gather the evidence on the Minnesota bagman, a guy named Robert Drano, and fed that to Bobby Kennedy and his investigators. And it ended up with an indictment of Hoffa and the bagman and several others in Chicago. Miles wasn't trying the case, but he'd go out there periodically to check in on the trial. And he was out there one day sitting in the front row, and when Robert Drano got on to testify, he saw Miles there, and he started screaming and cursing and chased Miles out of the courtroom. So it's Miles being chased by Drano, being chased by Jimmy Hoffa. And it ended up with Hoffa cornering Miles and one of Kennedy's investigators and spitting on him in the hallway. And Hoffa was convicted.
Fascinating story. Let's talk a little bit about Miles as a judge, which of course occupies a good part of the book that you've written. But before we get to the Dalton Shield case, which is so interesting and fascinating, what he did there, you know, a lot of us remember, perhaps some of you out there remember as well, the time when girls couldn't participate in organized sports in high school. When I graduated from high school, I thought the girls in my class were far better athletes, but there was no sports team for them. We all know that Title IX came along a few years later and made that opportunity equal. But Miles played a role in pushing that forward, didn't he?
He did. And I was one of those girls who didn't have an opportunity to participate in sports when I was growing up. So this was before Title IX, as you say, Judge, and Miles was assigned a case of two high school girl athletes, one a tennis player and one a cross-country runner and skier. There were no girls' sports teams in their high school, so they wanted to join the boys' teams. And there was a Minnesota High School League rule that prohibited girls from participating on the boys' team. So they filed suit, and the case was assigned to Miles. And he had considered himself up to that time kind of a classic male chauvinist. It was kind of a product of his upbringing on the range when there were clear roles for boys and girls and men and women. And he kind of viewed the case with skepticism at first, but his daughters and his sister kind of worked on him a little bit, and he ended up ruling that the girls had to be allowed the opportunity to participate on the boys' teams. It was an equal protection case. And he, throughout his life, he saw the benefit of that case. He saw his own granddaughters get to play hockey and slam the boys around the hockey rink, and he viewed it as one of the his proudest moments on the bench.
Miles was involved in politics as a young man. How did he first get involved in politics?
He came down from the Iron Range to the Twin Cities to go to school at the University of Minnesota and get his law degree there as well. And that was in the 1940s when Hubert Humphrey was making his first run for mayor of Minneapolis. And Hubert, I was just fascinated by this history of the young men. They were all men, unfortunately, but the young men who coalesced around Hubert in those early days. Hubert was kind of a Pied Piper, and the people who gathered around him, Miles being one of them, but Walter Mondale, Don Frazier, Orville Freeman, Gene McCarthy. I mean, names that would go on to be vice presidents, senators, governors, Orville Freeman, mayors, most of whom came from, as Miles and Hubert did, small towns, grew up without a dime. But they shared a philosophy that it was their duty to help the least fortunate among us, kind of a social gospel view. And that's how Miles got his start in politics, fell into Hubert's orbit.
And I don't know that he ever really fully left politics, even though he became a federal judge. Tell us about 1968 when two of his best friends were running against each other for the Democratic nomination for president.
Yeah, so Miles at that point had been on the bench for 2 years, and he found himself right in the middle between Hubert Humphrey and Eugene McCarthy, who were both running for the Democratic presidential nomination. And more than that, they were fighting for the soul of the Democratic Party and in many ways the soul of the country. With Hubert being vice president and really being saddled with LBJ's approach to the war, and Eugene McCarthy, of course, leading the Children's Crusade against the war. And Miles appointed himself the unofficial envoy between the two camps, and he was in regular communication with both men and their staff. And they kind of used him as an intermediary to pass information back and forth. Now, of course, he was a federal judge, and he should not have been doing any of this. But he was willing to give up his judgeship, he said, for his grand vision, which was Hubert as president and Eugene as vice president. And I thought that was kind of, when I was reading this, so what I found in my research, Miles' daughters had given me access to all of Miles' private papers, with no strings attached. And one of the best, most exciting for me finds was letters that Miles was writing in this period to Hubert. So he'd spend the day with Eugene and then write a long 5-page letter to Hubert about what was going on. And he wasn't like he was snitching on Eugene. Each candidate knew that Miles was providing information back and forth, and they used him. And in fact, it turned out that Hubert was funneling some money to Gene McCarthy, too, because they thought that McCarthy could help knock out Bobby Kennedy. Yeah, he never really gave up politics. It was always a part of him.
It's such interesting stories. I do shudder a little bit when I think about some of the things he did as a federal judge, but he got by with it, and he certainly, made his mark. I before I went to law school, I spent about 3 years on Senator Humphrey's staff, and we were officed in the same federal courthouse that Miles had his chambers and courtroom in, and he would come down often. He and Humphrey were good friends still at that time, and you had to worry a little bit because sometimes Miles would call and he'd disguise his voice and he'd sound like an angry constituent or something and get everyone all upset. But one day he called and asked for me, and I'd pick up the phone, and is this really Miles calling? And he's kind of a hushed voice, and he says, I'm calling from the courtroom, and you're going to law school after this, aren't you? And I said, yes. Come on up. In about 5 minutes, things are going to get really interesting up here. It'll help you. So I went upstairs from the 4th floor up to the 6th floor, walked into the back of the courtroom, and lo and behold, literally all hell broke loose. He issued some kind of ruling, and there were objections and people screaming, and it was quite the show. And then fast forward some 20-some years later, the first hearing that I held as a federal judge back in late 1995, back of the courtroom, in walks Miles. He sits back there with a little grin on his face, and I think, well, should I introduce him? I don't know. I'm not really sure what to do. And after about 10 minutes, he got up and walked out, and it was just sort of a nice little, full circle there that he came in and watched. He was that kind of a person.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk a little bit about the Dalcon Shield case, because you got a front row seat to one of the most significant cases, really, in terms of protecting injured people that our country has ever seen. And Miles wasn't originally assigned that case, was he? Tell us how he got into it.
Yeah, so the Dalcon Shield IUD in the 1970s was the best-selling IUD in the world, with millions sold. It was manufactured by a Fortune 500 company based in Richmond, Virginia, the A.H. Robbins Company. And the problem with the IUD was it had a multifilament tail string that whipped bacteria into the uterus, and it caused horrendous infections in tens of thousands of women. Many lost their fertility and some died. And the litigation had started in the 1970s, and it was assigned to MDL, multi-district litigation judge in Kansas City. And it went through all the discovery there, and then the cases were remanded back to their original jurisdictions for trial. So Miles was not involved for the first 10 years of the litigation. And when the cases came back to Minnesota, Minnesota had more Dalcon Shield cases than any state in the country except for California. And it was just clogging the court system. And so the federal judges decided that they were all going to divide up the cases. Each judge got 21 cases. And this was in 1983, right when my clerkship was starting, and Miles got his set of 21 Dalcon Shield cases.
And so follow through the process. I think that perhaps one of the other judges maybe had an earlier trial on the issue, but Miles decided he personally had to do something about this once he started reading about and understanding really what was going on. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, so this is a good example, as I said earlier, that Miles would get the same kind of cases as other judges, but just run with them harder and further. And so the other judges, as Judge Tunheim mentioned, started to try their cases one at a time. And the A.H. Robbins Company was really scorched earth litigation. So they would make these trials. These trials would last for 2, 3, 4 months. It would cost the plaintiffs $1 million or more to try a case. And the other judges in Minnesota started trying those cases, and the plaintiffs were getting verdicts, even a punitive damage verdict in St. Paul. But Miles decided to do things a little differently. He was watching what was going on, and so he did. The short story is that after 10 years of kind of stalemate litigation, Miles blew the cases out of the water in 90 days. And the way he did it was just, to a layperson, seems like common sense things, but to lawyers it just blew their minds. So the first thing he said was, I'm not going to try these cases one at a time. I'm going to try all 21 of my cases at one time, one big trial. And so we set a trial date for just a few weeks after he got the cases assigned. And then the second thing he did, which really ended up being the death knell for A.H. Robbins, was he reopened the pretrial discovery. The plaintiff's attorneys had been asking other judges for the ability to take the depositions of the top corporate officials and to reopen the document discovery. And they believed that the company was not producing secret studies of the tail string that would show bacteria wicking up the tail string. But other judges said, the rules are when discovery is done in MDL, that's it, and that was done years ago. Miles loved pretrial discovery. He believed in getting the facts out, and he was very active, rolling up his sleeves to make sure that happened. And an example of him rolling up his sleeves was he didn't believe that the normal pretrial procedures for discovery and document production worked very well because the defense attorneys, in this case, would have an incentive to not produce the documents because essentially you're squealing on your own client. And so that even the best intentioned lawyers, it put them in a very difficult position. So he often appointed special masters, but in the Dalcon Shield cases, he, on literally a moment's notice, jumped on a plane himself with his 2 law clerks in tow to go down to Richmond to help find the documents. And you can imagine the scene where this, when we showed up the next morning, they knew we were coming, but this federal judge who had made no secret about his views of corporations and hiding documents, and we're really like scamping through the hallways of this Fortune 500 company. And as the pressure grew to produce the documents, the company started offering larger and larger amounts to the 21 women who had cases in front of the judge. And the last 2 women were holding out as long as they could because their attorneys were telling them, for every day you hold out, there's a better chance of getting these documents that will help women all over the country with their cases. And one of the last women wasn't telling her husband what the settlement offer was for fear that he would make her take it. But finally, they all settled. But Miles wasn't quite ready to let it go, so he asked that the three top officers from the company appear in his courtroom for a final settlement hearing. Now, he didn't have this wasn't a class action. He didn't have the authority to do anything about the settlement or order these officers to appear in his courtroom.
This is almost unheard of, by the way.
Yeah. But they were kind of freaked out, and they didn't know whether to come or not. But they figured they were more afraid of not coming than coming. So they showed up in court, and Miles had prepared a little speech for them. And he had the weekend before he had asked me to help edit it, and he had a habit. He was never far from a dictaphone, and he would dictate his thoughts and get them typed up, and it turned out to be great for my research because all this contemporaneous thoughts were in his boxes. So he had dictated a speech, and he played it for me before he asked me to edit it, and it went something along the lines of "Rise, you sons of bitches, and hear these words." And, he looks at me expectantly, and I'm like, I'm just 5 months out of law school, and I'm like, well, Judge, maybe we could tone it down a little bit. So we did tone it down a little bit, but it still packed a punch, and he read the speech to the officials in open court, and this is before the term became popular, but the speech went viral coast to coast. It was reprinted verbatim in newspapers around the country, in the Congressional Record. The A.H. Robbins Company filed judicial misconduct charges against the judge based largely on the speech, which brought more attention to the speech. It kind of backfired on the company. And the short story is the judicial misconduct charges were dropped, but the speech and the judge's actions took on a larger significance. Other judges around the country now started ordering production of the documents, which the plaintiff's attorneys would go into court and just say, "We want the Judge Lord documents." And then a former in-house counsel for A.H. Robbins read about the judge's speech and drew courage from it. He had been out of office for 10 years or so, and he came forward and testified in deposition in Minneapolis that 10 years ago the company, he had been ordered to gather up the most problematic documents from the high company officials and destroy them, and he had done that. And there's only one thing in litigation, in my experience, that's better evidence than smoking gun documents, and that's evidence of document destruction. And that really led to the company's bankruptcy, and in the end, some 300,000 women received $3 billion in damages. But it took 30 years from the beginning of the litigation until the last of the bankruptcy cases.
It's a fascinating story, and what's interesting about the book, I think, is the insider viewpoint that you had during this critical time of the litigation and what Judge Lord did to try to resolve it. So it's a fascinating story. Did you keep notes from that time yourself, so you recalled precisely what went on? How did you recreate those chapters of the book?
Yeah, I did have some notes from that time, and then I reassembled all of the court documents, so all of the pleadings, all the transcripts, and then interviewed a number of the attorneys who were involved in the case. And one of the great things about the transcripts was not only in those 90 days that Miles was presiding on the cases, he held hearings almost every day, and sometimes multiple hearings in a day. I mean, when he got involved in one of these cases, he was going around the clock. I mean, he'd call me up at 4 in the morning and say, "Let's meet in chambers in a half an hour," and there were transcripts not only of the formal hearings, but when we would go in chambers. When we went down to Richmond, the judge would leave after a couple of days, and he left me down there with a couple of special masters, and the company had court reporters who would follow us wherever we went and kind of be talking to the court reporter, and so there was an incredible, almost minute-by-minute record of what had transpired.
We're going to ask the audience here if they have questions in just a few minutes, but I don't want to miss out on talking about the reserve mining case, which is also a hallmark of Judge Lord's career and the shutting down of the plant. Talk a little bit about reserve mining.
Yeah, I think that reserve mining and Dalcon Shale were his two biggest cases involving large corporations, and Reserve mining, the case was filed by the U.S. Department of Justice in 1972, and it was the biggest environmental case of the early environmental era. And Reserve was operating a taconite plant up on the north shore of Lake Superior, a huge plant, and employed thousands of workers, one of the biggest employers in the state. But it was dumping its taconite waste pellets, the tailings, directly into Lake Superior. 67,000 tons of waste tailings dumped directly into the lake every single day. And the citizens of Duluth and other North Shore communities were drinking that lake water unfiltered, and it would be discovered in the course of the litigation that the fibers in the tailings were virtually identical to asbestos, which of course is a cancer-causing substance. And not only was it in the lake water, but it was being spewed into the air through smokestacks. Miles, this is another case. I mean, he wasn't assigned the case initially. Another judge was, but that judge became ill and asked Miles to take it over. And he was very conflicted at the beginning because growing up on the range, he knew the value of those jobs, and many of the workers were boys, now men he had grown up with, even some family members. And the Department of Justice was so concerned that they considered moving to disqualify him at the beginning of the case because they thought that he had favored the company. But in the course of the pretrial proceedings and a 9-month trial to the court, he became convinced that Reserve would have to move to on-land disposal where the pellets and the fibers could be contained in a site. And Reserve kept saying that was impossible to do, and he ordered them to produce any documents they had that would show contingency plans. And Reserve kept saying that they didn't have any such plans because it was impossible to move to on-land disposal. And this goes along with the theme of Miles loving document discovery. He didn't believe them, and he told the Department of Justice lawyers to subpoena Reserve's parent corporations, which they did, and it turned out that there were hundreds of documents, including fully engineered plans for on-land disposal, which did not make the judge happy, let's just say. And he ordered the CEOs from the parent companies to come to court, and when they kind of stonewalled, he was prepared to give them several years to convert to on-land disposal if they would agree to that. In a very dramatic Saturday hearing, kind of eyeball to eyeball, he lost his temper and sent his law clerks back to Chambers to redraft his order, and came on the bench later that same day and ordered Reserve to shut down its operations by midnight of that very day, which was 7 hours away. They shut down that night, and then on Monday morning ran to the 8th Circuit, got the judge's order stayed. There were years more of litigation, but to make a long story short, Miles was eventually removed from the case by the 8th Circuit for bias. Judge Devitt from St. Paul took over. In very many ways, he was the polar opposite of Miles, Democrat, Republican. But Judge Devitt adopted all of Judge Lord's orders and even fined the company for hiding the documents in front of Miles. And he also ordered on-land disposal, but he gave them years. And in the end, it took 8 years of litigation for the dumping to stop into the lake. Fascinating.
I'm sure that some of you might have questions. Let's open it up for the opportunity to ask some questions of Roberta. Anybody?
Shy bunch.
There we go.
I was curious whether you got a sense of the conversations where Judge Lord was working between Humphrey and McCarthy, if that ever was something that was seriously considered, and what an interesting ticket that would have been.
Yeah, so when I first heard about it, I thought it was just pie in the sky. But as I did further research, it was actually, Humphrey actually mentioned it in some press articles that there had been consideration to it. In the letters that Miles was writing, he would write that he had, the letters were all to Hubert. If there were letters to Eugene, I never found them in my research. And he would say, he would tell Hubert that he would raise the issue with Eugene, and that Eugene was noncommittal. And if you know anything about Gene McCarthy, it sounds like kind of typical Gene McCarthy, not really indicating one way or the other, or sometimes casting aspersions on the idea, but never saying no. And Miles kept pushing it and pushing it all the way really up until the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. At which point both Hubert and Eugene told Miles, just forget it, it's not going to happen. But it does seem really like it could never have happened. But there was, I think, fairly serious consideration to it. And Miles would talk in the letters about how he'd tell Eugene how much fun it would be for the two to be campaigning. And we go back, because back in the 1940s when this group of guys got together, 1948 is when Hubert first ran for the Senate and won, and that was the first year that Eugene ran for Congress in St. Paul and won, and he borrowed an old sound truck from Hubert to help his campaign. So these guys had quite a history between them, and I spent a lot of time just kind of thinking about what was going on in 1968 and what they all must have been thinking, and then trying to psychoanalyze Gene McCarthy, which was tough duty.
And despite how much Miles tried to get them together, I think McCarthy gave a rather lukewarm endorsement of Humphrey just at the very last minute of the campaign. It was not, his followers did not fall in line and go for Humphrey that fall.
Yeah, and Miles spent a lot of time after the convention trying to get McCarthy to endorse Hubert, and he didn't do it, as the judge says, until 6 or 7 days before the election, and at that point it was a lukewarm endorsement, and many people would blame McCarthy for Hubert losing that very close election. But one of the things that I found so interesting was that Miles could, like a classic Ranger, could make enemies and keep them for life. And I learned who his enemies were when I was clerking for him, but he always loved McCarthy, even though and Miles loved Hubert more than anybody on the face of the planet. And there was McCarthy possibly costing Hubert the presidency, and yet Miles still remained very close to McCarthy. And McCarthy, when I was clerking, would sometimes stop by and they'd had lunch. And McCarthy, who had disdain for most politicians, he loved Miles. And I think, so I spent a lot of time trying to figure that one out, and I think it was because they each saw in each other that the courage that each one of them had to kind of go it alone and walk their own path, no matter how tough things got.
Yes.
Why did he leave the bench after 19 years?
Yeah, so he was, I think he was about 66 years old when he left the bench, about a young 66. I mean, he went into private practice on a small firm with his kids. I think he just got, I was one of his last law clerks, so I was there kind of almost to the end. And I think he just wanted to get out and be with people more. Being a judge is a lonely pursuit, and Miles was very much a people person, and he felt that his close to 20 years was enough time. He's kind of worn out. I was surprised by the Dalcon-Shield battle. I mean, I was surprised when after he first offered me the job in that phone call. The next year I spent working at the paper. I was covering basically cops, so if it was a slow night, I would do my homework, or I would, but now I would go back and I'd read all the clips on Miles. And I was surprised when I got to know him personally and clerked for him, how hard he took all the controversies, because I had this image of him as kind of a judicial pigpen, kind of walking and stirring up this cloud of dust and just, smiling and going on, and it not affecting him. And he really took these battles personally, and I think, the combination of reserve mining and then Dalcon-Shield, I think he just wanted to get out.
Yes.
Could you discuss Miles' role as counsel to P9 during the Cornell strike?
Yeah, so I don't know anything about that really.
Oh.
Good question. When I started the process of writing the book, I'd love to write, and I'd written a lot, but never a book. And read a lot about how to structure a book, and one of the authors who I admire the most had written about you got to have a beginning and you got to have an end, and most people go on too long. So I decided to really stop the book when he retires.
Yes.
Tell us what made him say ignore the Supreme Court.
Yeah. So.
And did it follow him? You mentioned that it followed him.
Yeah. So the details of the story were as I mentioned, the Minneapolis and St. Paul were ready to convert to daylight savings time, and that very morning, the attorney for mostly the outstate theater owners filed a petition with the Supreme Court, and it was very odd because the Supreme Court is normally closed on Saturdays, but they not only the court staff but the chief judge of the court was there, and to accept the petition and immediately order an injunction. And the chief judge was a Republican with whom Miles had sparred over the course of several years, so there was no love lost between the two of them. So it was kind of an odd order by the Supreme Court to. There was no way that Minneapolis and St. Paul could stop this from going forward. I mean, this was so crazy that for the next couple of weeks while it was fought out, everybody was on a different clock. So train schedules, bus schedules, nobody knew what time it was. At the Capitol, the legislature was on one time and the governor's office was on another time. So, I mean, in part, I think it was this animus between Miles and the chief judge, but in part it was trying to bring some order to this situation. I mean, somebody had to jump in, and then it got worse because the Supreme Court ordered Miles to appear at a hearing in front of the court to explain his actions, and he declined to go. And the Governor Freeman, sent a letter. This was a huge constitutional crisis because Freeman sent a letter to Miles telling Miles not to go because of separation of powers. Miles wasn't inclined to go anyway. So anyway, it was a huge deal. And in the end, the legislature finally got its guts and ordered daylight savings time. But it would follow him. So when he was about to be appointed U.S. Attorney for Minnesota in 1961 by John Kennedy, his buddies Hubert and Eugene were the senators from Minnesota and put his name forward. And John Kennedy and Bobby in particular didn't want to have anything to do with Miles. They did not want, because of the censure. I mean, it followed them. And they opposed the nomination. And in fact, Bobby Kennedy paid a visit to McCarthy and Humphrey's Senate offices the night before the nomination was to be made to try and convince them to pull it. But they stood by their friend from the 40s. I mean, these guys were buddies for life. And it was so bad that the press reports from the day that Miles' name was submitted had unnamed administration officials saying he's not our guy, and if things go bad, don't blame us. But it turned out that Bobby Kennedy and Miles would bond over the prosecution of Hoppe.
Anyone else? Yes.
Do you know whether Miles considered running for any other office after Attorney General?
He loved politics because he loved people. He loved campaigning. He loved people. His wife, Maxine, not so much. And she kind of told him that's it. The one part of politics that Miles didn't like was raising money because he felt that would make him beholden to people. And I think really being a federal judge was the best spot for him because, as a politician, he'd have to make compromises, to get things done. And as a federal judge, he had the power of one, and he liked that quite a bit.
Hand back there.
I wondered if there was any case that you know of where he felt he'd gone too far or not far enough.
So one of the things that I found in his dictations was that the only regrets he had were cases where he did not go far enough. So he, and when I got to see him in Dalcon and after the speech, and I mean, you can't imagine the controversy that speech caused. And he took it really hard, and he maybe said things that maybe he somewhat regretted a little bit, but he really didn't. And when he, after he stepped down from the bench and got to reflect, he said that his only regrets were times that he didn't go far enough.
One final question, Roberta. Characterize Judge Miles Lord for us. Do you consider him to have been a populist? Was he a law and order guy? Was he a progressive? Give us your summation of what he was in his various roles in his life.
Pretty much all of the above. I mean, he's really hard to put in a bottle and characterize. I mean, now law and order, some people might think, how does that fit this guy? But from his, because of the years that he spent as a prosecutor, when he got on the bench, he, while plaintiff attorneys loved him, criminal defense attorneys hated him because he would help, if he didn't think the government attorneys were doing a good enough job, he would jump in and help question. So it's hard to, I'd say, labels really are hard to pin on him. I even don't like the label activist judge, even though, it's kind of an obvious label for him, but it carries connotations that I don't think are always fair. So I would just, I would just say that he was a judge who thought that the legal system worked better for people with money and power than it did for the little guy, and he made it his mission to help even the playing field for the little guy.
Thank you for writing a terrific book.
Thank you.
Now, I don't know about you, but I kind of, thought I knew something about Judge Miles Lord. I learned so much more today, and I expect that if I pick up that book, there's even some additional information I'll learn about him. Congratulations, Roberta Walburn, on a fantastic book. Another round of applause for her. And of course, I'd like us to give a last round of applause to Judge Jack Tunheim for just an extraordinary moderation of this wonderful conversation. Thank you so much, Judge. Now, as I mentioned earlier, today's program is brought to you by Thomson Reuters and Books for Africa in recognition of their 30th anniversary, and we'd really like to thank Books for Africa for this extraordinary partnership. And we'd like to invite everyone that came to today's program to join us out in the foyer for some refreshments and an opportunity to speak with our author and our honored guest, the Chief Judge.
And can I just mention that my longtime law colleague, Mike Cerisi, has donated 100 of the books to go to Books for Africa.
Oh, awesome. So please join us outside.